So I'm going to talk about Thinking Digital. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you a bit about the conference and things like that if you aren't familiar with it. But I'll talk a bit more about some of the backstory behind kind of how it grew and whatnot, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. Another title of this job is How Social Media Saved My Job, and hopefully that'll become apparent a little bit later on in the talk. Okay, so first a bit about me. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, and that's the Brooklyn Bridge. You probably all recognize that. I was raised most of my life in New Jersey. I went to university in New Jersey as well. I came over to the UK in 1997 for the first time in terms of relocation. This is Oxford, for those of you who don't know. I wasn't going to school there. I was there to set up Blackwell's online bookshop. And there I am, obviously thinner and younger and just, right. And I've been in a variety of different roles since then. As I think as I mentioned, I went to go work for Bertelsmann, the German publisher, to work on BOL.com and QXL.com. I'm happy to say all my .coms still exist, which is, a kind of achievement for me. In 2002, I relocated to the Northeast to set up what became Codeworks. And then I met my partner, and then we had a baby, and she's from Merseyside. And for those of you who've had children, there's this sort of weird home tractor beam that pulls you back in. And so I actually now spend my weekends in Liverpool, but still based here in the Northeast doing Codeworks and other interesting and hopefully cool projects. So a bit about Codeworks. So we were set up, we were legally formed in 2003, effectively spun out of One Northeast to support and help grow the sort of the digital cluster here in the northeast of England. We're doing this, basically the company split into between half the company that does basically techie projects in software development and collaborative research, and the other half that does a lot of basically networking clustering events, of which Thinking Digital has sort of grown out of. Right, so I mentioned 2002, 2003, financed primarily by the EU and One Northeast. We're not-for-profit. And basically, the early years were very good. We got involved in a big European Framework 6 program project. We were successful in leading a bid into the UK Technology Strategy Board. We were spinning out companies. We were growing the membership. So we have currently about 323 company members who all pay to be members of our various networks. And life's good. And then inevitably, when you're in a kind of public sector realm sort of thing, the sort of political environment changed dramatically. And so all things digital, we're not in favor with our funders for a little while there. And it was during this period that they really came after us in all sorts of different ways to try and trip us up and say, like, were you doing something? And the only thing they could catch us on was that our private income was relatively low. And that was primarily because we were concentrating on trying to do good things like fund Nick's 3D stereoscopic project, among other things that we were doing at the time. So at this time, what happened was that they refunded our projects, but with a massive increase in private income targets. So we had to we were collecting about £90,000, and in 1 year we were going to have to quadruple that to £350,000, which, for any business, that's a lot more money to try and have to find. And we were in a position where we could just simply jack up the prices of, say, our membership by a factor of 4 and not have people notice. I was happening to reading a book at the time called Good to Great, which hopefully some of you have heard of, if not actually read it. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. And there's a lot that's in the book, but there are sort of three things that were particularly sort of big takeaways in the book, which is really around trying to get you to focus on fewer things, right? It's not so much what you should do, but what you should stop doing, right? And really to look at what are you good at doing, what are you passionate about doing, and how do you use those first two things to actually, financially support your business, your organization, or your cause, or whatever it might be. And it was around this time that I was not a big reader of The Guardian at the time, but we happened to have a subscription, and I happened to pick up The Guardian. It's not often you find money-making ideas in the pages of The Guardian, but I happened to find one. And they were talking about this conference called TED. And this was back in 2005. And they said, there had been a kind of pilot conference in Oxford at the time. And they said, the woman wanted sort of wax poetical about it. So I checked it out. And I eventually managed to find my way to get into the TED conference, which was an application thing. And I went, and like many people who go to the event, was kind of, it was a kind of life-changing experience, right? It was, I thought we were doing a pretty good job in terms of running events and conferences at the time, but this kind of totally redefined what good looked like in my eyes. The other thing I've kind of make some quick calculations about is that these guys were clearly making a tremendous amount of money. They're a charitable organization, but right now I think they've got about 1,500 people who attend. They're paying on an average of something like, £3,000 to £4,000, right? So you do some quick math there, right? And then that ticket income is roughly doubled by sponsorship income. And you think, Christ almighty, for a 3 or 4 day event, they're bringing in a tremendous amount of money. So maybe if we could get to this kind of level of quality, we could find a way to sort of help support, some of the charitable things or not-for-profit activities that we're trying to do here in the Northeast. And hence was born the concept Thinking Digital. And so we really we were slightly cocky at the time, and we had this little internal expression about we were going to go big or go home, right? So we were going to really bet the company basically on this event. And so we went and we tried to find the best speaking talent we could find, some of the biggest names. And so that was Ian Kennedy, who was the head of innovation for Cisco. This is Tara Hunt. She was one of the sort of the early leaders of what became the Barcamp movement and author of a couple of books. This is Sean Phelan. He founded a company called Multimap, which probably most of you have used at one point or another. And then he talked about his journey in founding the company and then selling it to Microsoft. We then, of course, had Microsoft come in talking about some of the really cool digital media tools and products that they were currently developing, and they gave a couple of really cool demos. This fellow here, you can kind of barely see him, his name, Casper Barry. He gave a talk about, he's a former professional poker player, spent sort of, I think, 5 years in Las Vegas, applying his trade, came back to the UK, and actually started talking about being a poker player and applying that to business and risk in life. He was the poker advisor on Casino Royale. This fellow here, Jonathan Harris, who's spoken at TED and PopTech and at the World Economic Forum, and talks about a project called We Feel Fine. You should Google it and check it out if you're not familiar with it. If you have any interest in design or interface design, it really is a really cool project. I won't go into it too much now. Ray Kurzweil, the noted futurist, author of The Singularity is Near, who's got all sorts of amazing sort of prognostications and predictions. He'll probably recognize this man. Greg Dyke came and spoke about basically how he got fired, what happened in that process, which is obviously a fascinating insider sort of look as to kind of what happened during the period and his kind of conflict with Blair and Brown. Aubrey de Grey, the noted futurist who is working on anti-aging and has made the famous prediction that everyone in this room, or everyone around him, would live to 1,000. And he sort of gave some evidence as to why he thinks that's going to be the case. Dan Lyons, who is a technology columnist for what was then Forbes and is now at Newsweek, but perhaps best known for writing a blog called The Fake Steve Jobs, or The Secret Diary of Steve Jobs, which is obviously a sort of piss take on the inner thoughts of what Steve is thinking. Dan Pink, this is him here speaking at the TED Global event in Oxford this summer. Doug Richard, who you guys will recognize from BBC Dragon's Den. Jessica Flannery from Kiva, and so we basically, we really went to town on trying to get some globally recognized talent. We invested in a new brand, a new website, our first blog. We brought in some great sponsors from the previous relationships that we've had. We were doing print ads, online ads, email marketing, leaflet drops. So we took the sort of marketing textbook and we kind of rolled it out there. Yeah. And and not surprisingly, with this huge investment, Thinking Digital was a huge success from day one. There was only one problem, which is that this is actually not true. Despite the investment, we were really struggling. We had a nice initial burst of sort of sales when the tickets were like ultra cheap kind of thing, and then just a kind of like big long quiet period where no one was coming. And all this sort of brave talk about good to great and the TED conference, really kind of became much more about survival and really not humiliating ourselves in public. So it was a big struggle. There was a lot of sort of begging and borrowing and pleading and whatnot. We did get there in the end. We didn't sell out by some distance, but we had a kind of respectable size audience. It was a massive resource black hole. We lost more than double what we had forecasted, but we did survive. And picking up the pieces, convinced our board that we would roll the dice again in 2009. And so we launched the conference, and 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. And this was obviously the beginning of the sort of the big credit crunch, if you will. And things started to sort of fall apart a bit for us, where Microsoft then pulled out of the conference because they had no, and Cisco pulled out of the conference. So our biggest sponsors were now pulling out as well. So we just thought, I'm not sure if I can say this because we're being filmed, but are we just because this is like, I cannot believe this is just the worst possible time after struggling so badly the first year. This is the worst. This must be the worst possible way to launch the second conference. But after that sort of period of time, after that sort of September, October, as things settled into November and December, obviously we continued to sort of plug the conference. We just started to notice that, for some reason or another, people were buying tickets in much bigger numbers and much earlier, and unrelated to actually any marketing that we were doing, in sort of strange numbers. And so by around January, by the time we came back from Christmas, we basically canned all of our marketing. We had we sort of doubled our marketing budget from 2008 to 2009, and we ended up canceling most of it. By the time the 2009 conference came around, we sold out 2 months early. Our attendance was way up, our ticket revenue was way up, et cetera, et cetera. And we converted what was a big loss into a break-even situation. In 2010, so this year we're lucky enough to sell out 4 months early. We've expanded the conference by a further sort of 100 spaces, and we've only got 25 spaces left at this point. So there's a little bit that we're kind of quietly working through our wait list to unload those. But we haven't spent anything on media. I mean, literally zero. And I'm gonna think now. I think this is where the video can. There's a video. It plays for about 4, but I'll only show you about half of it in the interest of time, just to kind of give you a flavor of what the event's like if you haven't been to it.
I've never been to a technology conference like this before, and what I'm really impressed with here is the huge spread, the diversity of interests that are being portrayed and talked about.
Thinking Digital is terrific because it's not just a conference. It's a meeting of like minds. It's a happening. It's a collision of all different approaches and different ways of viewing the world.
I want to talk to you about disturbing the universe from a completely different viewpoint. I want to tell you how in particle physics we not only disturb the universe, but we quite literally shake it to pieces.
This is a molecule. This is the fluoxetine of the scent industry. It doesn't really smell like anything, but it has an effect. It's astounding. Perfumer said to me, it's like pouring liquid halogen light into your perfume. It makes the entire thing glow.
It's the quality of the speakers that they managed to get here. It is literally the propeller heads from all these fantastic companies. So they may not be quite on the company message, but they're telling you what companies like Google and Microsoft and Virgin are actually out there doing.
At the moment, we think of the internet as the world's ultimate copying machine. It's called a 3D printer. And people think we'll have these at home connected to the internet, and we could be printing out physical products. There is currently a professor, Adrian Barrier, at the University of Bath, who has created a 3D printer that can actually print out a 3D printer. So this is scary stuff, and it's real, and people are absolutely terrified.
One of the reasons that we set up Thinking Digital was to create an environment over 2.5, 3 days where genuine new business connections and relationships were going to be formed.
The big thing that makes it different from other events is that idea that everybody hangs out for a few days.
The amount of times I saw people looking to each other, people they'd never met, and making a comment or asking a question, the amount of business cards and Twitter handles that were exchanged, I think that's where the value really, really comes from.
So, right. So what happened, I suppose, is perhaps a good question to ask. So I talked before about 2008. Lots of negatives that we've talked about, big loss, etc. But there were a lot of positives as well. One of the things, we were so novice at this whole thing that we put out an online survey that was actually 11 pages long. Right, this is massive. Right, it was just like 78% of the people who attend the conference actually fill the whole thing out. It was actually, when I tell people, I think it's absolutely shocked. But it was, I guess, a measure of for the people there that of the kind of enthusiasm I think they had for the format that we had brought. And that our dedication to good content and creating a user experience that was we spent a lot of time in the little details of things was noticed, and that was great. We had lots of, and people, and I think with the things that the people were telling us, it wasn't kind of like, yeah, I had a really great time and things like that. We had 12 people tell us that it was the best conference they'd ever attended. One guy said he cried during one of the presentations. You think, I've probably had plenty of feedback in my life, and it's the intensity of the emotionality was surprising. There was also, and this is kind of where the social media stuff comes in, there was also a lot of luck that we had. I'd love to say we had this brilliant social media strategy and really kind of kicked in and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of it just happened to us. I mean, we're a positive victim of social media in many ways. So one of our speakers also happened to be one of the UK's biggest technology bloggers, a guy named Steve Clayton from Microsoft. Geek in Disguise is his blog, and I couldn't have literally written a better blog in terms of I suppose in a positive way with regard to the event, and he said lots of nice things about Thinking Digital, etc. This was another completely out of the blue. And we'd invited loads of people to come and cover the conference as journalists and things like that. And we didn't know, Sky News didn't actually ever come back to us, so we didn't think they were going to be coming. And they showed up, and they came and they videoed they videoed a lot of the conference. They created a 10-minute piece that got lots of airtime. And maybe 5 years ago, that would have been kind of the end of it, or I would have maybe I would have been lucky and got like a tape of it or a DVD of it. But of course, these days, lots of this stuff, or most of this stuff, is actually available online. So I can now send out to everyone a link to this video about the conference, and this is like, so I mean, I literally couldn't have paid them, to do this, and they went and did this great thing, and now I could say, hey, look, check out our Sky News video, and that was another big piece of luck. Probably the biggest, because I spent the first year, May 2008, at our conference, making fun of Twitter, because it was just starting to become into prominence kind of thing. I just thought, what tremendous waste of time, et cetera, and what I didn't pick up until well after the conference was over is that there were people using Twitter and communicating. This is now quite an established thing to do, which is obviously communicate to other people going to a conference and sharing thoughts about speakers, about the event, and things like that. And it was only so much after I realized that people were talking quite actively about our conference and saying really, lots of great things. But probably the most surprising thing, as we looked at what was happening going into 2009, was that if we looked at our web traffic, and in 2008, not surprisingly, Google was our top referring website. In 2009, Google remained our top referring website. In 2008, Twitter was basically, it was really not a factor. It was way, way, way down kind of thing. But by 2009, that number goes up by a factor of 7. Right, so it's a massive jump. And if we look at the sort of, when people talk about where, in terms of people who actually bought tickets, again, Twitter ranked really, really highly. And so this, was just a huge, huge change. And it was funny because we really weren't actively monitoring all this sort of stuff, and it was just kind of happening to us in the background. And this really was where a lot of the source of these unknown registrations effectively were coming from. So some implications, because I'm sure I must be running out here. So, right, it's this whole idea about, I call Twitter and all these different social tools putting word of mouth on steroids, right? So word of mouth has always been an extremely powerful thing. Tools like Twitter and Facebook and others, though, are letting people broadcast those things out and connecting to friends of friends and various different ways of connecting things to get that word of mouth out to people much more quickly and easy than before. And we're going away from depending on brands like some of these brands here. I put the president up here because I consider the president to be a brand as well, who use traditional tools to broadcast and and shout at us with the messages they want to sort of pin into our brain. And we're going to where we look to our family, our work colleagues, our friends of our friends, and our friends of friends of our friends for where the truth may lie. Now, of course, this isn't equally applicable across all matters, but certainly for what I do and for a lot of other businesses, I think this kind of a phenomenon is going to be increasingly important. And I'd like to think that it again, maybe not for every single product category or service category, that it could lead to a future where we focus less and less on spin. It's less about promotion. It's less about figuring out what's the soundbite, and actually creating better products, better experiences, better services, what have you, because the truth is out there, and the truth is going to be is already increasingly easier to find, and hopefully ultimately lead to a happier situation for all. And that's the end of my talk. So thank you for listening.